Good day. This is Mr. Kilroy on behalf of the Freedom Pages. Today I have to deliver, or feel compelled to deliver, bad news. I do this with a very heavy heart. I thought I lived in a free country. I thought I lived in a country where there was an impartial judiciary. But it seems to be a very capricious impartiality. Bruce Montague is a gunsmith, and he is no stranger to the guns rights movement. In fact, he's been a very active participant in the campaign to rid us of the Firearms Act. Now, this is some background. Bruce lived up in Kenora, Ontario, Rigby to be exact. He was a fully licensed gunsmith, meaning where he lived, he was doing work for the police force, i.e. repairing their firearms, maintaining their personal firearms, and he was no stranger to the police force. I've met Bruce, and he is a very kind, thoughtful man. I've worked on his appeal to the Ontario Supreme, or to the Ontario Court of Appeal. Albeit late, I did discover evidence and research supporting the fact that firearms ownership in Canada is indeed a right. Now, I've stated this before in several videos, so there's no need to go into the details. Recently, Bruce was in court once again, but this time not as the subject of a criminal action, but rather trying to save his property. The subject of this property is his collection of firearms, valued at $100,000. These firearms were ordered forfeited to the Crown, not because they were part of any sort of crime spree or part of any criminal act, other than the fact that Bruce had allowed the registrations and his licensing to lapse. He did this in order to protest the Draconian Firearms Act that was enacted through Bill C-68 in 1995 by the Chrétien government and the then Attorney General Alan Rock. These firearms were part of his inventory. Some of them were his, some of them are heirlooms handed down to him. But that should be neither here nor there. What it comes down to is that the only crime Bruce committed was a victimless crime. It was an offense against the Firearms Act, not against a person, against an act of the government. He did this in order to challenge the law. And this is the crux and subject of my video today. We, as citizens and subjects of the Crown, have the right to challenge law. The unfortunate part is that we have to break said law in order to challenge it, in order to get our day in court. It took a very long time for Bruce to even get arrested. He did backflips and handstands trying to get arrested, which tells me that either the government feared the weakness of its law and feared that if it ever went to court, that it indeed would be struck down as being just that, bad law. Oh, if that had been so simple an argument. When the police finally did arrest him, they threw everything at him but the kitchen sink. The number of charges they laid at his feet beggars the imagination, creating an environment where Bruce and his legal defense team, which again was all grassroots, funded by people like other firearms owners, and again gave the man nothing but grief. He originally had planned to use the equity in his home to fund his defense. Catching wind of this, the then Attorney General of Ontario, Michael Bryant, then proceeded to put a lien against his property, thus precluding any sort of mortgage being taken upon it. Now he is left without funds. Fortunately, the appeal went out to the firearms community and everybody helped. Or a lot of people helped. It has cost Bruce in excess of $200,000 to mount his challenge. And when all was said and done, he was found guilty by Justice Wright in the Superior Court of Ontario, who in his decision admitted that firearms ownership was a right. However, in this particular instance, if Parliament wants to downgrade it to a privilege, they have that right, apparently. That was the first shoe to drop. The second shoe to drop was in the Ontario Court of Appeal. I did a great deal of research, and having found that indeed the constitutional right for Canadians to have arms for their defense existed in our Constitution, gave this information to Bruce's legal defense team, only to have the English Bill of Rights of 1689 be rather unceremoniously dismissed by one Justice Moldaver of the Ontario Court of Appeal. I was present in the courtroom, and I was absolutely flummoxed when he said, "The English Bill of Rights? Why, wasn't that just some sort of protest?" I could understand if you grew up in a vacuum and did not go to law school and did not study the law and really have the average Canadian could not name 3 rights that they have written in the Charter of Rights, let alone a document that is an appendage to the main part of the Constitution. But this is a justice, a very learned man, dismissing this. I believe the word for this is willful blindness. But moving along, in fighting to keep his property, and here's the next one. It took the court an entire week to release its decision, and it was quite short and quite terse. Needless to say, Bruce and we Canadians lost. But moving along, Bruce, trying to stop the loss of his property, went back to court again recently, and another shoe has dropped. Now this is a very big creature if it's got more than 2 feet, but another shoe dropped, where the judge in this case stated, rather matter-of-factly, but you brought all of this on yourself. You broke the law. Regardless of what reason you had for doing it, you broke the law. So you are the author of your own misfortune. Well, I could understand that sentiment if Bruce had actually gone out and hurt somebody and gone out of his way to cover that up. But Bruce was exercising a very fundamental, and believe it or not, quite an ancient principle, that one has the right to challenge a bad law. Why I say it was ancient is that such a principle goes back even to the Magna Carta, which the Magna Carta is a product of the barons in England standing up to the king, who had the opinion that the law resided in his mouth. So whatever he said was law. And they did that violently. The dismissed English Bill of Rights was the product of the common people, viz. Parliament, which is the House of Commons, standing up to the king. They too were willing to do violence. The English Bill of Rights was no protest. It was a well thought out, took a year to put together piece of legislation. It prescribed very carefully the grievances of King James, the Catholic, which would be James the Second, I believe. The things that he did to his Protestant people, his Protestant subjects, that were all contrary to the laws and statutes of the realm. And it very carefully prescribed every remedy to these grievances. Protest my eye. It was a righting of wrongs. It was the culmination of what has been known as the Glorious Revolution. And why it was glorious was not a single shot was fired. King James abdicated. King William, well, but his abdication didn't sit well with him, and later he did try to take back the throne. And two battles, the Battle of the Boyne 1 and 2, decided, now these battles were fought in Ireland, by the way, decided that no, William of Orange will be the king, and he had the full backing of Parliament. And it was because of the English Bill of Rights that he did have the full backing of Parliament. So this was not a protest. Bruce peacefully exercised the same concept of standing up to a bully. And this bully took the form of a government that ignored its own laws. The Constitution of Canada has been stated by the Supreme Court of Canada to be the supreme law of the land. And I refer back to the Magna Carta once more, in the principle that even the monarch is subject to the law, states that our Parliament cannot ignore the law. We in Canada have the good fortune of having a codified constitution. Unfortunately, in England, the English Bill of Rights still stands as ordinary statute, although a very important piece of statute and considered an important imperial constitutional document. Because it is not codified under a single constitution, it can be ignored. Though one would have to wonder, why would the very document that gives Parliament its sovereignty be ignored by the said same Parliament? Would it not imperil its sovereignty in doing so? But that's an aside, and I digress. The Parliament of Canada has no such luxury. It must obey the law. I wish I could say that this was the end of this sad saga. Bruce and his wife Donna now have to make a determination as to whether to pursue this to the Supreme Court of Canada. The appeal that had been lost in the Ontario Court of Appeal, they did try to have the Supreme Court hear it. But because the three justices that heard Bruce's case all nodded their heads in unison, i.e., no dissenting opinion, could not appeal to the Supreme Court by right. They had to do so by leave, which means they had to ask the Supreme Court if they would hear their case. The Supreme Court of Canada said, nope, we're not going to do it. No. As disheartening as it is, it's not surprising. It actually took the Supreme Court of the United States some 60 years to hear the Heller case. Not that the Heller case is 60 years old, but it was a case that was brought before them, and they did deign to hear it. And it was an actual and direct assertion of the Americans' Second Amendment rights. So it wasn't surprising initially that the Supreme Court of Canada would not grant them leave to appeal. So I suppose it is a very ponderous decision as to whether to try and once again appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada by leave the decision of the recent decision of one of the lower courts. Now, the remainder of this is my own humble opinion and does not constitute any opinion beyond my own, and I have no intention of libeling anybody in this. Upon the release of the Ontario Court of Appeal decision, it was the day that I lost hope or trust in the judiciary, and it was the refusal of the Supreme Court to grant leave that I finally lost any belief in our judicial system. Yes, I am a very biased person. I have skin in the game, and I do not like the Firearms Act, and I do want it gone. But I am unbiased enough to recognize when a court is playing social engineer. I know some people look at an activist court as being one that uh, places its own personal agenda ahead of the elected parliaments. But we're not talking about an agenda. We're talking about a cold, hard fact in law that such a right exists. And by giving deference to the legislation, they have exercised activism. Usually it's when they go against the government that they are viewed upon as being activist. But when Parliament is clearly wrong and has disobeyed the supreme law of the land, it is the duty of the court to remedy it. The law must be found in no force or effect, and that is not a principle that should be wielded so capriciously. Their impartiality falls into question when they do not apply the law, or when they capriciously construe the written law in a manner and fashion that furthers an agenda. There is little doubt that gun control is an exercise in social engineering. When something is just as much a part of Canadian heritage as firearms ownership, and both the government and the court decide that it is a part of Canadian heritage that needs to be removed, that we must look at these institutions and question their abilities. It is only very convenient that the feminist-driven gun lobby, or gun control lobby in Canada, latched upon a tragedy to further its agenda. They had an only too willing parliament that was more than willing to capitulate with a government that feared private firearms ownership in Canada. It remains still nebulous, a nebulous anecdote of its source, but I have heard or have read that Jean Chrétien had penned a letter stating and articulating this fear that there were so many firearms owners in Canada with so many firearms. He feared that his government would enact the law that would wake this sleeping giant, and they would actually do something about it. Well, having lived in Canada for as long as I have, um, all of my life, outside of a small fringe group in Quebec known as the FLQ, I've never seen such or any evidence to support Mr. Chrétien's assertion. We are a very peace-loving people in Canada. Price of gas swings 10, 15 cents in a week. We shrug our shoulders and pay it. In some countries, such an increase would spark riots in the streets, but not in Canada. We are kind of like the hobbits of North America, if the analogy is apt. Adventure makes one late for dinner. Finally, the Montagues have one final impending problem before them, and that is the Ontario forfeiture law that will try to seize their family home under a proceeds of crime law, which was designed to stop criminals, gangsters, and the like of from profiting from their crimes. Stop a murderer from writing a book about his crime and selling the movie rights to it. Carla Homolka and Paul Bernardo and that other fellow, I cannot remember his, Clifford Olson, from profiting from their misdeeds. It states very plainly in the Forfeiture Act that any property that is the direct result of the proceeds of crime is forfeit to the Crown. Now you get a hearing on this, you get to go to court, but you now must prove a negative, which again is fundamentally contrary to the principles of our legal system or our laws. It's a reverse onus. So which means Bruce and Donna have to dig up every piece of paper that they can lay their hands on that shows that their house was bought and paid for. As a matter of fact, they built their own house, they bought the land, and the money for this came from an inheritance. But now they have to show and prove this. Now, until Bruce had let his license lapse, his gunsmithing license, he was engaged in the lawful profession or trade of gunsmithing. The trade itself is lawful. Yes, you do need a license now, but his special licensing was to deal with fully automatic firearms so that he could repair said firearms for the police. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. The fact is that gunsmithing is not drug dealing. It's not an activity that is proscribed by law or forbidden by law. It is an actual profession. It put food on his table. Are we to deduce that crime put food in his family's mouth? A lawful or legal activity is not a criminal activity by its very definition. My takeaway from this experience is, and as I see other events in the news unfold, that unless you happen to be one of the very, very special people, one of the cause celebs of the progressives, you will get short shrift from both the courts and the government. Arguably, Stephen Harper's Conservative Party has used firearms owners in Canada. He threw us, well, the coin, Dr. Evil, he threw us a frickin' bone here, getting rid of the registry, and that was it. It was part of the Conservative Party's platform to completely reform the Firearms Act. Thus far, the promise of this is evaporated, and I believe a great many firearms owners are now not going to follow that carrot. Without mentioning names, we have seen the Supreme Court rule in favor of someone who has taken up arms against Canada and her allies, be granted hero status, basically, by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ordering the Conservative government of Mr. Harper to bring Mr. I'm not going to say his name, back to Canada. And he is a fellow that has actually hurt people in his taking up of arms against his country. But if you happen to be named Montague or Smith or Jones or whatever, not one of the special people, you happen to live in a remote area of Northern Ontario, the Supreme Court won't say boo to the government because they happen to be of the opinion that only the police and military should have firearms. And that is a sad day for Canada. It is a sad day for your rights and your freedoms. Because basically, you are left with but tooth and nail to stand up against the bullies. This is Mr. Kilway on behalf of the Freedom Pages, wishing everybody a wonderful day.